You know how life can take an unexpected turn? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I recently lost my husband, and to be honest, I didn't know what to do with my life anymore. The empty house, the lonely nights, it all felt suffocating. So, I decided to do something completely out of my comfort zone. I booked a solo cruise to Greece. I thought maybe the sea, the sun, and some distance from everything that reminded me of him might help. The cruise was beautiful, I won't lie. The ship had everything. Pools, amazing restaurants, shows at night. But even so, I felt this emptiness inside me, as if that trip wasn't really going to heal me. The first night, for example, was supposed to be relaxing. I was in the restaurant, dining alone. There were other people around, laughing, talking, living their lives. I just wanted to feel normal again. And that's when I saw him. Across the room, sitting alone, was a man who made me choke on my food. I could hardly believe my eyes. He looked so much like my late husband that for a second, I thought I might be dreaming. I sat there, frozen, staring at him as if time had stopped. But then he looked up and our eyes met. My heart raced. He looked back at me with a gaze I knew so well, but at the same time, it seemed different, darker. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the grief. After all, my husband was dead and buried. Couldn't be him, could it? I looked away, took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. When I looked back at the table where he had been, he was gone. No sign of him, as if he had never been there. I was left with a strange feeling, a discomfort I couldn't shake for the rest of the night. Maybe it was just the sadness, mixed with the loneliness, playing tricks on me. At least that's what I wanted to believe. That night, when I returned to my cabin, I closed the door behind me and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But deep down, a part of me knew that something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong, and I was about to find out just how wrong. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling still weighing on my chest. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. After all, the ship was full of people. It was possible I saw someone who resembled my husband, and my brain, in the confusion of grief, had distorted things. I decided to leave the cabin and explore the ship, trying to distract myself. I wandered around the upper deck with the pools and lounge chairs, and then went into one of the souvenir shops. I was flipping through a random book when, suddenly, I felt that presence again. I didn't even need to look up to know he was there. It was like the air around me had gotten heavier. I slowly turned my head, and there he was, standing on the other side of the shop, this time closer than the night before. He wasn't doing anything, just watching me, as if he were waiting for something. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That resemblance, it was impossible to ignore. I hurried out of the shop, trying not to draw attention. I walked down the corridor, not looking back, but I could feel his eyes on me. I knew he was following me, even if I couldn't see him. When I turned the corner and glanced back, he was gone, disappeared like a ghost. But I knew he hadn't left. I spent the rest of the day trying to avoid crowded places, basically hiding. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. How could I? I could barely believe it myself. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that empty, almost cold expression. When night fell, I was exhausted, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I sat on the bed in my cabin, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when the most disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't just my imagination? What if I was really being followed? What if that man was real but somehow different? With every minute, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I got up, went to the cabin door, and locked it, as if that could protect me. But deep down, I knew that a simple lock wouldn't be enough. Something was happening, something I couldn't understand. And the worst part was, as much as I wanted to run, we were at sea. There was nowhere to go. I tried to convince myself again that I was overreacting, that it was just grief, stress, loneliness. But every time I thought about his expression, that same expression I knew so well, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something much darker was happening, and I had no idea what it could be. And the only thing I knew for sure was that he, whoever or whatever he was still watching me. That night, insomnia took hold of me. I tossed and turned in bed, listening to every sound the ship made, every creak, every distant footstep in the hallway. The image of that man, or whatever he was, wouldn't leave my mind. I realized I had to do something about it. I had to confront him. I couldn't keep living like this, being chased by a shadow from the past. The next morning, I left my cabin determined. I was ready to find out who he was. I spent the entire day searching for him, walking through every corner of the ship, but he seemed to have vanished, as if he had never existed. With each passing hour, my desperation grew. Had I imagined it all? It wasn't until nightfall, when the ship was quieter, that I saw him again. He was on the most isolated deck, the one where almost no one goes, staring out at the sea as if lost in thought. A shiver ran down my spine, but I knew I couldn't back down now. This was my chance to confront him, to end this nightmare. I walked up to him, trying to stay calm. My heart was racing, and with each step, I felt like I was getting closer to something I shouldn't be. When I finally stood just a few feet away, he slowly turned to look at me. "Who are you?" My voice came out more firmly than I expected, but I was trembling inside. He didn't answer. He just looked at me with that same empty, dark gaze I had seen before. And in that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong. His face, his posture, everything was identical to my husband, yet completely different. It was as if he were a shadow, a distorted memory. I tried to speak again, but the words died in my throat. He smiled, a smile that chilled my blood. And then, without a word, he started to walk away, heading towards the darkest part of the deck. I followed him, driven by a mix of fear and a need for answers. But when I turned the corner, he had disappeared. The space was empty, as if he had never been there. I was alone again, with only the sound of the sea as company. Desperate, I ran back to the common area of the ship and searched for a crew member. When I finally found someone, I tried to explain what had happened, describe the man, begged them to find him. But they looked at me like I was crazy. No one else had seen him. It was as if he were invisible to everyone, except me. The fear I felt in that moment was something I had never experienced before. It wasn't just the idea of being followed. It was the sense that I was dealing with something beyond comprehension, something that defied reality. I was alone in this, and the more I tried to understand, the deeper I seemed to sink into an endless abyss. And the worst part? Deep down, I knew that this wouldn't be the last time I saw him. That night, I returned to my cabin with an unbearable weight on my shoulders. The thought of being alone in that cramped room, with the walls seeming to close in around me, terrified me. But I had no choice. I locked the door, checked the lock 3 times, as if that could protect me from whatever was chasing me. I threw myself on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this was all just a nightmare, something that would end as soon as the cruise was over. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was as if, at any moment, he could appear there, in that room, just a few feet away from me. And then it happened. I was almost drifting off when I felt, more than heard, his presence. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and there he was, standing in the shadow, in the corner of the room, almost blending into the darkness. His eyes were 2 cold points of light, watching me with that empty expression, as if I were just an object. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I were paralyzed, frozen by terror. He took a step towards me, and that's when adrenaline finally kicked in. With a quick motion, I reached out to turn on the lamp beside the bed, hoping the light would drive him away. But when the light came on, he was gone. The room was empty. Only the sound of my ragged breathing filled the silence. I jumped out of bed, trembling from head to toe. I opened the door and ran down the ship's corridors, not knowing exactly where I was going, just needing to get out of there, away from that place. I passed a few passengers, all of them looking at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I needed to find someone, I needed answers. I ended up finding one of the crew members, and once again, I tried to explain what was happening. I told them about the man, how he appeared and disappeared, how no one else seemed to see him. And that's when, for the first time, I saw a glimmer of recognition in their eyes. They took me to a small room where they kept records of the passengers. When I started describing the man, they flipped through some pages and then stopped, showing me a picture in an old registry. It was him. The same face, the same look. That man. He died on board 2 years ago, the crew member said, their voice low, almost as if they were afraid someone else might hear. I felt my body go cold. Couldn't be. It didn't make sense. But there was the proof right in front of me. The man I had been seeing, who was following me, was dead. And yet I had seen him several times. He had been in my room, watching me. But what did it mean? And why was he following me? The only thing I could think of was that somehow he was trapped there on that ship. And for some reason, he had chosen me as his next victim. In that moment, all the certainties I had disintegrated. Nothing made sense anymore. And now, the only thing I knew was that, until this cruise ended, I wouldn't have a moment of peace. After that revelation, I didn't know what to do. I went back to my cabin, but the thought of being alone in there terrified me. Every shadow, every sound seemed amplified, as if he could appear at any moment, from any corner. But exhaustion eventually overtook me, and somehow, I fell into a light sleep, filled with confused nightmares. When the sun finally rose, I felt a bit safer. The daylight seemed to dissipate some of the fear, but not enough to make me forget what was happening. The ship was nearing our final destination, and the thought of stepping on solid ground again was the only thing keeping me sane. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The day dragged on slowly, each hour more sluggish than the last. I did everything I could to avoid being alone, blending in with the other passengers, trying to act normal, but every time someone walked past me, I wondered if it was him, disguised, just waiting for the right moment to appear. Finally, night fell, the last night on the ship. Only a few hours left until disembarkation, and I was determined not to sleep, to stay awake until I could leave that place for good. But, as always happens, exhaustion won out, and before I knew it, my eyes were closing. It was the sound that woke me, a whisper, low and almost imperceptible, but close, very close. I opened my eyes suddenly, my heart racing, and there he was again, standing at the foot of my bed. His eyes watched me, full of an intent I couldn't decipher. This time, I didn't try to turn on the light. I didn't try to run. I just stared back, trying to understand what he wanted, what I needed to do to end this. Then he began to move, slowly, walking around the bed, never taking his eyes off me. My whole body was tense, expecting the worst, but he did nothing. He just kept watching me, as if he were waiting for something from me, something I didn't know how to give. The clock on the wall ticked each second, each minute, and I felt trapped in a kind of limbo, unable to flee, unable to fight. Finally, he stopped by the window, where the curtains swayed gently with the sea breeze. He looked outside into the darkness and then back at me. And then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but clear enough for me to understand. "Don't forget me." Those words echoed in my mind as I watched him turn and disappear into the darkness, as if he had never been there. I stayed there, paralyzed, trying to understand what it all meant. But there was nothing more to do. He was gone, and this time I knew he wouldn't return. The next morning, when the ship finally docked, I was one of the first to disembark. The sensation of stepping on solid ground should have brought relief, but all I felt was a strange melancholy, as if part of me was still trapped on that ship. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the wind blows strong and the silence settles in, I can still hear those words, like a distant whisper. And no matter how hard I try, I've never been able to forget him. You know that feeling of euphoria when everything seems perfect? That's exactly how I felt on the first day of the cruise. The sun was shining. The sea breeze was in the air. That salty smell. Everything was wonderful. I spent the entire morning taking pictures, capturing every moment, every detail. I wanted to show everyone how much I was enjoying myself. In the afternoon, after lunch, I decided to take a dip in the pool. I left my bag on one of the lounge chairs in plain sight where everyone could see it. I didn't even worry about security. After all, I was on a luxury cruise. Who would mess with my things? After some time in the water, I went back to the lounge chair, ready to grab my phone and check my social media. But when I opened the bag, nothing. My phone was gone. I searched the entire bag, looked under the lounge chair, even asked the people around if they had seen anything. No one knew anything. The first thing I thought was that maybe I had left the phone somewhere else, maybe in the cabin. But I knew I hadn't. I was sure I had put it in the bag before going into the pool. Even so, I went to my cabin, hoping to find the phone there, but the search was useless. No phone. I started to get nervous. My phone had everything, my photos, my contacts, my messages. Couldn't just lose it. I went to the ship's reception, explained the situation, and they promised to let me know if anyone found the device. But honestly, it didn't seem like they were going to do much. I spent the rest of the day feeling strange, disconnected from the world, as if something important was missing. I tried to enjoy the cruise anyway, but that feeling of loss and unease wouldn't leave me. It was as if I were forgetting something important, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about how perfect everything had been in the morning and how, suddenly, everything started to go wrong. The lost phone was just an inconvenience, right? Things like that happen all the time. At least that's what I tried to convince myself. But deep down, something told me that this was just the beginning. And as much as I wanted to be wrong, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind that disappearance. Something I hadn't realized yet, but that was about to change everything. Little did I know this story was far from over, and what was coming was much, much worse. The next day, I woke up hoping that the phone had reappeared. As if by some miracle, it had materialized back in my bag. Of course, that didn't happen. But I was determined not to let this ruin my trip. I decided to distract myself, explore the ship, and maybe forget about the problem for a few hours. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk around the deck, breathe in the fresh air, and let the sea breeze calm my thoughts. That's when I saw him for the first time. A guy who seemed to be watching me. He was leaning against the railing, a bit distant, but his eyes were fixed on me in a way that made me uncomfortable. At the time, I thought it was paranoia, maybe the lack of my phone making me more anxious than usual. I shrugged it off and kept walking. I spent the whole day trying to distract myself with the ship's activities. I took a dance class, ate at one of the restaurants, and even thought about going to one of the shows at night. But that guy, the image of him standing there watching me wouldn't leave my mind. Later, when I returned to the cabin, I found something that completely unsettled me. My phone was there, right on top of the bed, as if someone had carefully placed it there. For a second, I felt relieved. Finally, my phone was back. But that feeling didn't last long. When I picked up the device, I realized something was wrong. All my photos were there, just as I had left them. But there were new photos too. Photos that I definitely didn't take. Images of the ship, taken from strange angles, as if someone had been watching me from a distance. There was a photo of me, taken from behind as I walked down the corridor. Another of me in the dance class from afar, almost hidden. My heart started to beat faster, panic rising inside me. How did this phone get here? And more importantly, who took those photos? I looked around the cabin, trying to find some answer, but I only found more questions. The feeling of being followed, watched, took over me. I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was messing with my life. Someone was close, much closer than I imagined. I thought about going to the ship's security, telling them everything, but what was I going to say? That someone was taking pictures of me and left my phone back in my cabin? What if they thought I was getting paranoid? The ship was big, full of people. How could I explain that I saw a guy who seemed suspicious, but had no proof that he was responsible? I sat on the bed, trying to piece together the puzzle, but every time I looked at those photos, I became more confused and scared. Whoever it was, this person wasn't just playing around. And that filled me with a fear I couldn't ignore. Something very strange was happening, and I knew that somehow I was at the center of it all. That's when I decided I needed to stay alert, very alert. And most importantly, figure out who was behind this before something worse happened. Because somehow I knew this was far from over. The next morning, still dazed by everything that had happened, I got ready and left the cabin, trying to act normal, as if nothing was wrong. But the truth was I was on high alert. Every person who passed me in the hallway seemed suspicious. Every glance I exchanged with someone made me paranoid. I knew I couldn't let my guard down. When I returned to the cabin later, I found something that made my heart race. An envelope with no name, no markings, just discreetly placed under the door. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. The words were short, direct, and absolutely disturbing. The note said something like, "You seem to be enjoying the cruise. Do you like the view from the upper deck?" "I do too." That detail, it was too specific. How did this person know I spent the morning on the upper deck? I remembered the man who had been watching me the day before, and the panic grew even more. Suddenly, everything made sense. It wasn't just the missing phone or the strange photos. I was being followed, watched every move I made. The cruise, which had once seemed like a safe and fun place, had now become a floating prison, and I had no idea who or what was watching me so closely. I tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. At every corner I turned, every corridor I walked down, I expected to see him, that strange man with the fixed gaze who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I knew I needed to do something, but what? Tell security? What if they didn't take me seriously? What if it was already too late? In the days that followed, things only got worse. Every time I returned to the cabin, there was a new note. Some were more direct, others more subtle, but all made it clear that I was being watched. One of them said, "Enjoy dinner tonight. The red dress will look great on you." I hadn't even mentioned to anyone which dress I was going to wear. How did he know? I began seeing the man more frequently. In the restaurant, in the casino, even near the pool. He never got too close, but his gaze was always there, fixed on me, as if he were waiting for the right moment to do something. I felt like time was running out, that something terrible was about to happen, but I didn't know what. Then, the most disturbing note of all arrived. "It's almost time. I hope you're ready." It was short, with few details, but enough to make me tremble from head to toe. Ready for what? What was he planning? I knew I couldn't keep going like this. The fear was consuming me, and I couldn't think clearly anymore. I needed to do something. I needed to find a way out before it was too late. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Whoever the stalker was, he was always one step ahead, and I was starting to wonder if I'd ever be able to get out of this. And that's when I realized whatever was about to happen was beyond my control, and I was completely alone. I was in total panic. With every new note, my desperation only grew. That last message, "It's almost time. I hope you're ready," kept echoing in my head, tormenting me. Ready for what? What was he planning? I couldn't think about anything else. I decided I couldn't just sit around anymore. I went to the ship's security and tried to explain what was happening, but it was like talking to a wall. They looked at me like I was crazy, saying it was probably just someone playing a prank, that these things happened on cruises. "Some bored passenger just trying to have fun," one of them said. Fun? I was terrified. I tried to insist, showed them the notes, told them about the man I kept seeing everywhere, but nothing seemed to convince them. To them, I was exaggerating, seeing things that weren't there. And the more I tried to explain, the more desperate I became. I left feeling completely powerless, as if I were trapped in a nightmare that no one wanted to wake me up from. When I got back to the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I had left it locked. I entered slowly, the fear growing with every step. And that's when I saw it. My room was different. My things had been messed with, as if someone had gone through them and left everything purposely out of place, just to taunt me. I looked around, trying to figure out what was wrong, and that's when I noticed. My phone was back on the bed, but this time, with a new series of photos. They were pictures taken inside my own cabin, as if the stalker had been there watching me while I wasn't. One of the photos was of me, sleeping, completely defenseless. That was the breaking point. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore, but I also had nowhere to run. The ship was at sea, and I was trapped, being hunted by someone who knew my every move. I grabbed my things and ran out, with no destination in mind, just trying to find a place where I could feel safe. I spent the rest of the day wandering around the ship, avoiding places where he might find me. But the truth was, no matter where I went, I felt like he was always watching me, always one step ahead. And then, at the end of the day, I found another note, left under a chair in the pool area. This note was different. It didn't have the threatening tone of the others, but it was much scarier because of it. You can't hide. I know where you are, and I'll find you when the time comes. I was on the verge of a breakdown. Every word of that note seemed etched into my mind. How did he know so much about me? How did he manage to find me no matter where I went? The idea that he might be manipulating everything around me started to eat away at me from the inside. That night, I couldn't go back to my cabin. I found a hidden corner on the ship, where I curled up, trying to keep my mind clear, trying to think of a way out of this. But the truth was, I was out of options. All I wanted was to survive until the end of the cruise, but with every passing minute, I felt like that was becoming impossible. And then, as I sat there, alone and scared, I realized the terrible truth. Whatever was about to happen, I wouldn't be able to stop it. He was waiting, watching, and I knew that somehow I was completely at his mercy. I stayed in that hidden corner for hours, maybe more. Every noise, every shadow seemed to come to life, as if he could appear at any moment. The ship that once seemed so big now felt smaller and more claustrophobic by the minute. I was cornered. That's when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. If I kept running, hiding, he would eventually find me. I was sure of it. I needed to face whatever this was. I needed to know who was doing this to me and, more importantly, why. I gathered what little courage I had left and went back to the cabin, hoping to find some sort of answer there. When I opened the door, everything seemed in order, which only heightened my anxiety. Every step inside the room was a battle against the growing fear. But it was when I looked at the bed that my blood ran cold. Another note, this time placed casually on the pillow. But this one was different from the others. The tone was more personal. The time has come. I'm waiting for you on the lower deck. Come alone or I'll come to you. I knew I didn't have a choice. If I stayed in the cabin, he would come to me, and I couldn't stand the idea of being caught by surprise. At least if I went to him, I might be able to defend myself, do something to turn the tables. But the thought of going down to the lower deck, that dark and nearly deserted place, was terrifying. With my heart in my throat, I grabbed my phone. Not that it would help, but it was the only thing I had left to make me feel a bit safer, and left the cabin, walking slowly toward the lower deck. With each step, the tension grew. I was on the verge of panic, but I forced my legs to keep moving. When I got there, the place was practically deserted. The lights were dim, casting long, sinister shadows. The sound of the waves hitting the hull of the ship was the only noise besides my quickened breathing. I looked around, searching for any sign of him, but the deck seemed empty. And then I heard it, a light footstep, coming from somewhere in the darkness. My heart almost stopped. I turned toward the sound, and there he was, emerging from the shadows as if he had always been part of them. The man I had seen before, the stalker, was there, standing just a few feet away from me with that same fixed, cold gaze. He smiled, a smile that made me want to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed with fear. He didn't say a word, just moved closer, slowly, as if savoring every moment. Everything in me screamed to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. And then he finally spoke, his voice low and smooth, but filled with something terrible. I told you you couldn't hide. Now it's too late. He moved even closer, and at that moment, something inside me snapped. Adrenaline finally kicked in, and I managed to move. I screamed, a scream that seemed to echo through the emptiness of the deck, and at the same time, I stepped back, tripping over something. What happened next was a blur. I remember seeing his hand move, quickly, toward me, and then a sharp pain in my arm. That was enough to make me act. With all the strength I had, I pushed him away and ran. I ran without looking back, without thinking about anything other than getting away. The panic was so intense that I didn't even realize where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. I didn't stop until I was back in the common area of the ship, where I finally found other people. My arm was throbbing, and I could feel the blood running down, but all I could think was that I had escaped, at least for now. I knew I needed help, and this time I wasn't going to take no for an answer. When I finally managed to tell the ship's security everything, they took me seriously, maybe because of the blood, maybe because of the desperation in my eyes. A search was organized, but I already knew it would be useless. The stalker disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. They never found him, never figured out who he really was or why he chose me as his target. But what remained was the fear, the certainty that even on solid ground, even far from that ship, I would never really be safe. And to this day, when I hear the sound of the sea or the footsteps behind me, I feel that same shiver run down my spine, because I know deep down that he's still out there, waiting. Working on a cruise ship was always my dream, you know? Traveling the world, meeting new people, and getting paid to make drinks for happy people. It was the perfect job for me. Everyone said I had a natural talent for making people feel comfortable, and I loved every minute of it. It was during one of those busy nights at the cruise bar that he appeared. A well-dressed guy, easy smile, one of those people who always seemed to be in a good mood. At first, he didn't stand out much, just another passenger coming to the bar to relax and chat. But he started coming every night, always choosing my bar to get his drink. At first, I thought it was nice. He seemed interested in learning more about me, asking about my life, what it was like working on a cruise ship. He had that way of someone who's lived a lot, knew how to tell good stories, and had a charisma that made people around him laugh. We laughed together, talked about everything and anything, and for a while, he became pleasant company during the long hours of work. But deep down, something didn't add up. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange feeling I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way he avoided talking about himself, always steering the conversation elsewhere whenever I asked something personal. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite being so sociable, he never seemed truly relaxed, always with an alert look, as if he were assessing everything around him. I tried to ignore those thoughts. After all, he was polite, funny, and genuinely seemed to enjoy spending time at the bar. There was nothing wrong with being friendly with a regular customer, right? Everyone on the ship seemed to like him, and I didn't want to be the only one to spoil the vibe. That's how our friendship started. I became more and more comfortable around him, and he always seemed to know what to say to make me smile. Even with that small hint of suspicion in the back of my mind, I let myself be carried away. After all, what could go wrong? He was just a nice guy, enjoying his vacation on a cruise. I just didn't know that behind that easy smile, there was something much darker, and that by trusting him, I was about to enter a nightmare from which it would be difficult to wake up. But that night, everything still seemed normal. I had no idea what was coming. That night, everything seemed to follow the usual rhythm. The bar was busy, people laughing, talking, enjoying the night. And, of course, he was there in the same spot as always with that smile that I was starting to find too familiar. But this time, he made a different invitation. After your shift ends, how about having a drink with me? Something outside the bar, just to relax. That's what he said, and I hesitated for a second. It wasn't the first time someone had made that kind of offer, but I usually declined. This time, though, I don't know why, something in me said it would be nice to step out of the routine, to accept the invitation. After all, he seemed harmless, and I knew him well enough by now, right? After my shift ended, I went to meet him at the agreed spot, a quiet little bar on the upper deck, away from the hustle and bustle. The night was pleasant, the sound of the sea in the background, and the conversation flowed as easily as always. He ordered the drinks, and I let myself get carried away by the atmosphere, trying to relax and forget my worries. That's when everything started to go wrong. After a few sips, I began to feel different. A little dizzy, as if the world around me was losing focus. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just tired, but soon I realized it was more than that. My thoughts started to get jumbled. My body felt heavy, as if I were losing control of it. I looked at him, trying to understand what was happening, but his smile was still there, intact, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But now, that smile that once seemed so friendly had something sinister about it. I tried to stand up, say that I needed to leave, but my legs wouldn't obey. Everything started to spin around me, and fear took hold. Before I could do anything, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my cabin, but something was wrong. My head hurt, and I felt confused, like I had woken up from a bad dream. I tried to stand up, and that's when I realized that my things were scattered, turned over, as if someone had been there. My heart raced and panic began to grow. I ran to check my belongings, and reality hit me like a punch. My money, my most valuable items, everything was gone. Even my documents were missing. On the table, where my passport had been, there was only a piece of paper, carefully folded. With trembling hands, I opened the paper. The message, written in neat handwriting, chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have trusted me." In that moment, everything fell apart. The friendship, the trust, the whole sense of security I had built disintegrated. I had been deceived, and now I was alone, with nothing and no one to trust. The panic was replaced by a deep sense of betrayal and fear. I knew that whatever he had done to me wouldn't end there, but the worst was still to come. I just had no idea how bad it would get. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling that everything that happened the night before could have been a nightmare. But it wasn't. The empty spaces where my valuable belongings should have been, and the sinister notes still on my table, were more than enough proof that it was real. My body still felt heavy, as if I had been hit by a truck, and my mind was a mess. I knew I had to do something, so I went straight to the ship's security. I told them everything. How he seemed friendly, how he invited me for a drink, and how I woke up without my belongings and with that frightening message. But to my dismay, they didn't take the situation as seriously as I had hoped. Without concrete evidence, without security cameras capturing the exact moment, everything seemed uncertain. They filed a report, of course, but they didn't seem willing to do much more than that. I tried to carry on with my work, but the sense of safety I had on the ship had completely vanished. Every time I returned to the bar, I felt exposed, vulnerable. And, of course, it didn't take long for him to show up again. At first, he kept his distance. I saw him on the deck, in the corridors, even in the restaurant, always watching me with that piercing gaze. He didn't try to talk to me, but just knowing he was nearby sent me into a panic. I felt like a trapped animal, unable to escape his presence. With each passing day, the situation got worse. He seemed to know exactly where I would be, appearing in the most unlikely places, as if he were always one step ahead. Even when I tried to avoid certain spots, somehow he was there, always lurking. I remember one time I was working at the bar, trying to ignore the growing fear. I was serving a customer when I felt that gaze. I looked up, and there he was, sitting at the back, calmly watching me. Our eyes met and my blood ran cold. The friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression, as if he were planning his next move. I tried to focus on my work, pretend I didn't see him, but it was impossible. My entire body was on high alert, every cell screaming that I needed to get out of there, run. When I finally got a break, I ran to my cabin, closing the door behind me as if that could protect me. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Even there, alone, I felt as if he could appear at any moment, as if he were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Fear turned into paranoia, and I started doubting everything and everyone. No one seemed to notice what was happening, and those I told didn't take me seriously. I was completely alone. That's when I began to realize he didn't just want to rob me. This was something much bigger, much more personal. He wanted to break me down, piece by piece, until I had nowhere left to run. And the worst part? He was succeeding. With each passing day, I felt weaker, more vulnerable. And I knew that if I didn't do something soon, he would get exactly what he wanted. But how do you fight someone who always seems to be one step ahead? I didn't know it then, but his game was far from over. And I was about to find out just how deep this nightmare could go. Finally, the cruise ended, and I thought it would all be over as soon as I set foot on solid ground. The relief of disembarking was almost tangible. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally, and all I wanted was to leave that nightmare behind, start rebuilding my life far away from that shadow that seemed to be chasing me. For a few days, it worked. I returned home, tried to focus on normal things, the things that had always been part of my routine before all of this. But deep down, the feeling of insecurity didn't go away. I still felt exposed, as if he could appear at any moment, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself that everything had stayed on the ship. Until one day, while I was shopping at a local market, it happened. I was distracted, picking out some fruit, when I felt that familiar shiver down my spine. I looked around, and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the end of the aisle, he was watching me. There was no mistaking it. The same cold gaze, the same disturbing smile, as if he knew exactly what that did to me. I froze. Everything came rushing back. The fear, the paranoia, the certainty that he had never really left. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that I was imagining things, but deep down I knew the truth. He was still following me, even on land, even after everything he had already done. I left the market as quickly as I could, without buying anything, and ran home, locking myself inside as if that could protect me. But I knew I was fooling myself. He had found me once, and now it seemed he was determined to keep the game going, only this time in a place I thought was safe. In the days that followed, I started noticing signs that he was around. Small things, but enough to push me to the brink of panic. An object out of place in my house, an anonymous message on my phone, even a simple knock on the door that, when I opened it, no one was there. Each of these things chipped away at my sanity, making me doubt everything and everyone around me. Then the letter arrived. It was left in my mailbox with no return address, no identifying marks. Just a simple message, full of menace. You thought it was over? This is just the beginning. It was as if he was feeding off my fear, enjoying watching me unravel. With each passing day, the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't sleep, barely ate, and leaving the house became torture. I started seeing his face everywhere. Every shadow seemed to hide his figure, and every strange sound made me jump with fear. I tried going to the police, but just like on the ship, they didn't take me seriously. Without concrete evidence, without a name, without anything to make them believe I was really being followed, they treated it as if it were just paranoia, a result of what I went through on the cruise. But I knew he was nearby, waiting, planning something. I was alone again, and now, off the ship, he had even more freedom to terrorize me. So, I decided I couldn't run anymore. I had to face him, somehow end this once and for all. I didn't know how, but I was determined to try. Because if I didn't do something, he would completely destroy me. But what I didn't know was that he was already one step ahead, and the final confrontation was approaching, faster than I could imagine. After receiving that letter, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep living like this, afraid of every shadow, every step behind me. It wasn't just a matter of safety anymore, it was a matter of mental survival. I needed to confront whatever this was, even if it meant facing the danger head-on. I decided the only way to end this was to lure him into a public place, where I could confront him and, if necessary, expose him so others could see what he was doing. I called him, using an unknown number that I knew he would answer, and proposed a meeting. My voice trembled as I made the invitation, but I managed to disguise the panic. I arranged to meet at a busy cafe in the city center, in broad daylight, hoping that the presence of other people would give me some advantage. At the scheduled time, I was there, every muscle tense, my eyes constantly scanning the area, expecting to see him at any moment. I knew he would come, This was the kind of game he loved. A new chance to torment me, now in a different setting. And he didn't disappoint. A little after the scheduled time, he showed up. He entered the cafe with that same unsettling calm that always accompanied him, as if nothing could disturb him. His eyes locked onto mine immediately, and that familiar smile, now tinged with malice, spread across his lips. He sat down across from me, unhurried, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The cafe was full, but everything around me felt distant, blurry. It was as if the world had shrunk to just the two of us, and the air between us was thick with tension. "So, what do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, even though fear was pulsing through my veins. He looked at me, as if savoring the moment, and then spoke, his voice low and smooth, but full of menace. "I just want to see how much you can take," he said. "How far you'll go before you break." That statement hit me like a punch. All of this, the stalking, the psychological terror, was just a game to him. There was no bigger reason, no specific motive, just the twisted pleasure he got from watching me suffer. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice firm despite the fear. "This ends here. Now, you're not going to control me anymore." He just laughed, a low, cruel sound that made my stomach turn. "You think you can stop this?" he asked, leaning closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "I'm already in your head. Even if you run, you'll never get rid of me. I'm the nightmare you'll never wake up from." In that moment, I realized there was no simple solution, no easy way to escape him. He was right about one thing: what he had done to me wouldn't go away anytime soon. But I also knew that if I didn't do something now, he would continue to tear me apart, bit by bit. So, without thinking much, I did the only thing that came to mind. I grabbed my bag, stood up abruptly, and with all the strength I had, flipped the table between us, spilling coffee, cups, everything onto him. The chaos that followed was immediate: shouts, people standing up, his shock, clearly not expecting that reaction. I took advantage of the confusion to yell for help, pointing at him and saying he was stalking me, that he was dangerous. The people around, who had been ignoring what seemed like a calm conversation, started to pay attention. Some even pulled out their phones to record, and that's when I saw, for the first time, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The cafe's security arrived quickly, and despite his attempts to slip away, people were already on alert, suspicious. He tried to leave but was stopped. I stepped back, still trembling, but with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. He was taken away by the police, and as I watched the scene, I knew this didn't mean the end of my nightmare. But it was a start. He wouldn't be following me, at least not for a while. And more importantly, I had proven to myself that, even after everything, I could still fight. I still have nightmares, still catch myself looking over my shoulder. But now I know I can face the fear. He tried to break me, but in the end, I managed to stand up again. And no matter how much his shadow still hangs over me, I'm no longer the vulnerable person he found on that cruise. Now I'm someone who survived, and that's something he'll never be able to take from me.